You're standing inside the Vatican. Not the part tourists take pictures of, but the Vatican that the Church wanted history to forget. Marble floors shined until perfect for God. Paintings on the ceiling were made to inspire holy people. But tonight, those floors feel like ice against bare skin, because 50 naked women are crawling across them. Cardinals look away. Bishops make shaking crosses in the air with their hands. And on his throne, laughing quietly, sits the man who people believe speaks for Jesus. Pope Alexander VI. You can't move. You can't stop it. You can only watch. But here's the scary part. This isn't even the worst part of the night. What you are seeing is just the beginning. The real, terrible thing. The thing that hundreds of years later would make even tough historians pause. Hasn't happened yet. This is the story of Lucrezia Borgia, a daughter trapped between evil men, a bride whose wedding night became Vatican legend, and a ceremony so terrible that Martin Luther would one day use it as proof that Rome itself had gone rotten. If you believe the darkest parts of history must be remembered, subscribe and tell me when you reach the moment that bothers you most. Because what happens next is not made up. It was seen, written down, and hidden. Let's begin. In the autumn of 1503, Italy was a mix of weak friendships, quiet fights, and powerful families held together by threats whispered behind locked doors. Rome stood at the center of this storm, not as a light of holy order, but as the kingdom of the Borgia family, whose ambition had reshaped the land through fear more powerfully than armies ever could. Under Alexander VI's rule, cardinals were bought like animals. Bishop jobs sold to whoever paid the most, and entire cities changed owners based on whether their rulers bowed down or fought back. Cesare Borgia, the Pope's son and enforcer, had carved a bloody trail from the mountains to the sea, leaving noble families shaking at the sound of his name. It was into this dangerous world that Lucrezia Borgia had been born, not as a daughter, but as something to trade. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza ended the moment it stopped helping her father's political plans. Alexander said it didn't count, embarrassing the Sforza family and forcing Giovanni into hiding, saying killers were chasing him from Rome. Her second marriage had seemed like a rare spark of hope. Alfonso of Aragon, a young man she truly loved, but love held no value in the Borgia house. 1 year after the wedding, Alfonso was dragged from his horse and stabbed on the steps of the Vatican. When he survived, Cesare made sure the job was finished, choking him in his hospital bed. Lucrezia had cried until her voice gave out, begging for mercy no one intended to give. The message had been clear. Her life belonged to the ambitions of others. Now, a third husband had been chosen for her. Alfonso d'Este, heir to Ferrara, a city whose importance could strengthen the Borgia legacy. To Italy, the marriage looked like a political win. To the Este family, it looked like a death sentence. Alfonso resisted at first. He sent diplomatic messages, excuses, and requests for delay. But Rome responded with cold clarity. Accept the marriage or be destroyed. Ferrara could not fight Cesare's armies or survive being kicked out of the church. And so Alfonso traveled to Rome, not as a groom, but as an unwilling sacrifice. His arrival at the Vatican only made his fear worse. The palace, half lit by candles and half covered in construction materials, rose above the city like a fortress ready for battle. Alexander greeted him with a smile too polished to be real. Cesare watched him with the calm of a man looking at a fragile object, one he could break without caring. Every feast, every hunt, every party carried the same quiet threat. You belong to us now. Meanwhile, tension grew inside the Vatican walls. Servants avoided eye contact. Cardinals whispered in hallways, their voices tight with worry. Strange people passed through secret passages at night. Even experienced officials felt something unnatural building, a show being planned with precise, disturbing purpose. Among them was Johann Burchard, the Vatican's master of ceremonies. He had written about scandals before, but this time an icy dread pressed upon him. He sensed this wedding would be worse than every sin he had ever written about, a turning point history would struggle to speak of. The stage was set. The trap was closing, and neither bride nor groom yet understood how deep this night would go. Alfonso enterrome. Small insults, Cesare's presence, growing understanding of the trap. Alfonso d'Este had spent his entire journey imagining Rome, not as a place of glory, but as a silent place of death. The winter roads from Ferrara had been cruel, hitting him with rain and frost. Yet none of it compared to the chill that crawled up his spine the moment he first saw the Vatican rising above the city. Half drowned in candlelight, half swallowed by shadows, the apostolic palace towered over Rome like a stone monster. Its walls were draped in construction materials and banners, giving the feeling of something ancient being rebuilt, not for beauty, but for war. It looked less like the heart of Christianity and more like a fortress preparing to eat those who entered. When Alfonso crossed the doorway, escorted by a handful of Ferraran guards, the air inside the palace felt unnaturally heavy. The hallways were lined with paintings showing saints and martyrs. Yet their painted eyes seemed to watch him not with blessing, but with warning. He was led to the grand audience room, where Pope Alexander VI waited. A man dressed in brilliant white and gold, his clothes shimmering with the movement of hundreds of candles. Alexander's face was warm, almost loving, but the warmth was fake like fire painted on paper. Beside him stood Cesare Borgia. Where Alexander radiated theatrical charm, Cesare gave off something colder, sharper, much more dangerous. He stood still, hands behind his back, dressed in dark velvet, his eyes looking at Alfonso with the detached interest of a man judging a tool he might soon throw away. At only 26, he had already become the most feared person in Italy. Cities gave up at the mention of his name. Nobles disappeared without explanation, and armies fell apart under the weight of his reputation. When Cesare tilted his head ever so slightly toward Alfonso, the message was clear. "You're no guest here. You're property. Alfonso Vauth." He spoke the traditional greetings. He thanked the Pope for the honor of the marriage, but every word tasted like ashes. Over the following days, the insults began, subtle at first, then clear. At the first feast, Alfonso found himself seated between two prostitutes whose presence was no accident. Their beauty stood out sharply against the seriousness expected of a papal celebration, and the cardinals watched with thinly hidden amusement as the heir of Ferrara struggled to maintain dignity. On the next morning's hunt, Cesare displayed his cruelty with chilling ease. His arrows flew with mechanical precision, killing boar after boar, while keeping steady eye contact with Alfonso, as if the hunt itself were a demonstration of how quickly life could be ended. One wrong step, one wrong expression, and Alfonso felt certain he would join the fallen animals in the dirt. During parties, Alexander VI made pointed jokes. References to the mysterious death of Lucrezia's previous husbands, delivered with a smile so casual that only Cesare's cold glance made the meaning sharp. Rome has not always been kind to her spouses. The Pope said once, swirling wine in his cup, but perhaps the third time brings God's favor. To the surrounding courtiers, it was a performance. To Alfonso, it was a threat. Every gesture, every glance, every carefully planned moment seemed designed to break him down, to wear away his confidence until nothing remained but obedience. And behind the show, the Vatican itself felt wrong. Servants avoided eye contact when Alfonso passed. Cardinals paused mid-conversation, their voices dropping to quiet whispers as he approached. Doorways he walked through moments earlier would suddenly fill with guards. Strange people, women, musicians, and attendants drifted through private hallways at hours no ceremony required. It was as though the entire palace was holding its breath. Even Lucrezia sensed it. She moved through the Vatican like a ghost, her steps light, her face distant. She said little, smiled rarely, and avoided her father's gaze as though she feared being called into something unholy. Alfonso began to understand this wedding was not a union. It was not a political alliance. It was a stage, a carefully built arena where the Borgia family intended to display its power before Italy and God alike. And he, like Lucrezia, was merely another piece in their theater of power. The understanding hit him with the force of a blade. There would be no dignity in this marriage. No safety, no escape. Alfonso had entered Rome as a prince. He now understood he might not leave it alive. If this story is already shaking you, if you're still here despite the dread building with every moment, then you're exactly the kind of person who keeps history's buried truths alive. So, before we go deeper, before the night inside the Vatican turns from terrible behavior to something far worse, make sure you're subscribed. Hit the like button so more people learn what really happened behind these walls, and tell me where you're watching from. As the wedding day got closer, a strange change crept through the Vatican. It began subtly. A few unfamiliar faces in private hallways, servants moving with hurried steps, whispered conversations dying the moment someone passed by. But soon the atmosphere thickened into something clear. Dread. The papal palace, normally buzzing with church ceremony and diplomatic activity, fell into an eerie, unnatural quiet. Servants who had once greeted visiting nobles with warm bows now kept their heads lowered, their eyes fixed on the floor. Cardinals muttered in tight groups, their robes rustling like restless wings. Every hallway seemed to echo with the same silent message. Something was coming, something the Vatican wished God could not see. Deep inside the palace, preparations unfolded far from public view. Cesare Borgia had taken personal command. He moved through hidden rooms beneath the papal apartments, giving orders in a voice calm enough to chill the blood of those who heard it. 50 prostitutes, the most skilled, the most striking, the most infamous in Rome, had been called under false reasons. Some believed they were being called to entertain foreign dignitaries. Others feared they had been selected for something far worse, but none dared disobey. When the Pope demanded your presence, refusal was not an option. They were escorted through hidden passageways lit only by lanterns, their footsteps echoing off the cold stone. Velvet gowns and silk robes were pressed into their arms by silent attendants. They sensed immediately that these clothes were not gifts. They were costumes for a performance none of them had agreed to. Several trembled as they entered the secret chambers beneath the palace. Some prayed, others cried quietly, wiping tears before Cesare or his guards could notice. They had heard stories about the Borgias, stories whispered in the brothels and wine halls of Rome, but no rumor had prepared them for being inside the Vatican under such circumstances. Witnesses, guards, attendants, scribes felt their stomachs twist with unease. No party required secrecy this suffocating. No holy celebration demanded prostitutes hidden in the depths of the apostolic palace. Every person who glimpsed even a fraction of the preparation sensed they were standing at the edge of an event that would stain their souls simply by witnessing it. And while this machine of silent corruption tightened itself behind closed doors, Cesare Borgia found herself increasingly alone. She'd been kept away from the final arrangements, left out under the excuse of tradition. But with each passing hour, the air around her grew heavier. Her maids reported prostitutes slipping into halls where no prostitute should ever appear. They whispered of Cesare's unusual movements of guards placed at doors that had always remained unguarded. Lucrezia felt it, the same dread that had drowned her during her second husband's murder. The night before her wedding, unable to bear the weight of the palace any longer, she ran to the Sistine Chapel. Beneath Michelangelo's vast, painted heavens, she collapsed to her knees. The flickering candlelight cast trembling shadows across the ceiling, as though even the creation itself pulled back from what was coming. She prayed, not for happiness, not for her marriage, but for rescue from a fate she could not name. The chapel remained silent, and in that silence, Lucrezia understood the truth. No divine hand would help. The Vatican was preparing something unholy, and she was already trapped at its center. October 30th began with the splendor expected of a papal wedding. Bells rang from the heights of St. Peter's, their echoes rolling across the 7 hills of Rome like an announcement from heaven itself. Crowds gathered outside the Vatican gates, craning for a glimpse of the infamous bride whose beauty and scandals had become the subject of Europe's gossip. Inside the apostolic palace, Lucrezia Borgia stood before her attendants as they prepared her with ritual precision. Her gown shimmered like liquid gold, every thread stitched with symbols of purity and nobility. Pearls decorated her long braided hair, catching the light with every breath she took. Her face, powdered to perfection, revealed nothing of the terror buried behind her eyes. When she looked in the mirror, she did not see a bride. She saw an offering. The ceremony was held in a chapel drowning in gold leaf, paintings, and sacred imagery, a room meant to elevate the divine. Cardinals lined the walls in their scarlet robes, standing with stiff posture and emotionless expressions. But beneath their practiced seriousness flickered clear dread. They knew the Borgia reputation. They sensed this ceremony was only a mask, a thin veil covering something far more sinister. Pope Alexander VI led the ceremony personally. His voice boomed through the chapel, echoing off golden walls as he bound Lucrezia and Alfonso in the name of God. His hands moved with priestly grace, yet everything about his manner radiated a darker intention, as though he alone understood what the night would bring. Alfonso stood beside Lucrezia, drained of color, his jaw clenched tight. He responded to the vows with the resignation of a man already mourning a life he had not yet lived. When their hands touched, Lucrezia trembled, not from joy, but from the knowledge that marriage in the Borgia world was never a beginning, only a sentence. After the final blessing, the newlyweds were escorted to the Borgia apartments for the reception. The grand hall blazed with candlelight, its ceilings painted with scenes of saints, heroes, and ancient myths. Enormous banquet tables overflowed with roasted boar, pheasants still decorated in feathers, pyramids of exotic fruit, and cups of dark wine. Musicians played soft melodies that drifted through the air like a fragile disguise. At first, the feast resembled any noble celebration: polite conversation, formal toasts, hollow compliments exchanged like fragile masks. But beneath the elegance, tension coiled. Servants moved with stiff movements. Cardinals avoided one another's eyes. Alfonso and Lucrezia sat rigidly beneath the watchful gaze of the Pope. Then, as the night deepened, the mass began to crack. Alexander VI grew louder, his laughter too sharp, too triumphant. Cesare, silent until then, rose slowly from his place at the table. With a subtle tilt of his head, he gave a signal no one dared question. The massive doors slammed shut. Guards stepped forward, hands resting on their swords. The musicians fell silent. The conversations died mid-sentence. The hall froze. Everyone understood that whatever this night truly was, it had only just begun. The wedding was over. The performance was over. Now the Borgia show, the real reason they had gathered, was about to begin. When the doors of the Borgia apartments thundered shut, a ripple of fear moved through the hall. Servants froze mid-step. Cardinals straightened instinctively as if bracing for judgment. Even the musicians held their breath, their instruments trembling in their hands. Then Cesare Borgia made a small gesture. At once the side doors opened. 50 prostitutes stepped into the hall draped in velvet and jewels. Their beauty was undeniable, but it could not hide the terror in their eyes. They moved hesitantly, as if searching for some escape route among the painted saints staring down from the walls. A hush fell over the room. A cathedral built for prayer, now frozen before an unholy show. Pope Alexander VI rose from his throne, smiling as though unveiling a masterpiece. He lifted his hand, and the prostitutes obeyed the silent command that followed. They began to remove their clothes. Silk slipped from shoulders. Velvet fell at their feet. Jewels glinted briefly before falling to the marble floor. Within moments, 50 naked bodies stood exposed beneath the blazing candlelight. Their shame was overshadowed only by the horror of where they were. Cardinals pulled back instinctively. Bishops traced frantic crosses over their chests. Several turned their heads away, but none dared move toward the exit. Cesare's guards blocked every door, their hands resting on the handles of unsheathed swords. Alfonso d'Este sat frozen, disbelief tightening every muscle in his face. This was his wedding feast in the Vatican itself, and yet it resembled a pagan ritual performed at the edge of hell. Lucrezia could not speak, could not breathe. Her tears slipped silently down her cheeks, absorbed into the embroidered silk of her gown. Alexander, however, was only beginning. With a flick of his fingers, he ordered servants to bring him baskets. They entered carrying woven containers overflowing with chestnuts. At the Pope's command, they scattered the nuts across the marble floor, the sound of rolling shells echoing like faint thunder through the hall. Then the Pope announced the next phase of his show. The prostitutes would crawl on all fours like animals between the legs of the cardinals and nobles to gather the chestnuts. The woman who collected the most would receive gold jewelry, silk cloaks, and treasures from the papal vault. Even experienced witnesses felt their souls pull back. 50 naked women dropped to their hands and knees, their bodies bent low to the floor as they crawled across the marble, reaching for chestnuts scattered among crimson robes and jeweled slippers. The cardinals, who moments earlier had prayed for dignity, now stood as unwilling pillars in a grotesque contest. Alexander and Cesare watched from a raised platform, laughing, pointing, and placing bets as though this were a performance in a brothel rather than the beating heart of Christianity. Some young clerics, drunk and overwhelmed, forced themselves to laugh along. Others bowed their heads, crushed beneath the wall between their faith and their terror of the Pope. Lucrezia sat motionless. Her wedding dress, once a symbol of hope, had become a shroud. And Alfonso, staring at the crawling prostitutes, the jeering clergy, and the triumphant Pope, finally understood. This night was never meant to honor his marriage. It was designed to break him, to humiliate Ferrara, and to ensure that no noble in Italy would ever challenge the Borgias again. Yet even this show, in all its blasphemy and cruelty, was not the darkest act of the night. The true nightmare was still waiting. As midnight rang over Rome, the last chestnut was gathered. The last prostitute collapsed in exhaustion, and the hall sank into a heavy, death-like silence. Wine-soaked tables stood abandoned. Cardinals stared rigidly at their plates. No one dared move or breathe too loudly. Then Pope Alexander VI rose, his voice cut through the silence with chilling clarity, a command, not a suggestion. He declared that the sacred duty of marriage must now be fulfilled, but not in private, not in dignity. Alfonso d'Este was to consummate his marriage with Lucrezia Borgia 3 times, and every person present would remain to witness and verify it. Gasps rippled across the hall. Several cardinals staggered to their feet, horrified, but Cesare stepped forward before anyone could speak. His presence alone silenced the room. He positioned himself near the doorway of the adjoining room, arms crossed, gaze sharp and unblinking. He was not only ensuring obedience, he was overseeing the ritual as though it were a battlefield maneuver. Alfonso rose slowly. His face had gone white, his hands trembling as he turned toward his bride. Lucrezia sat frozen, her tears dried into her skin, her spirit already broken by the night's degradation. When she lifted her eyes to her father, she found no mercy there, only expectation. She understood, then, that resisting would bring consequences worse than humiliation. It would bring blood. With no choice left, Alfonso guided Lucrezia toward the room set aside for the act. A room normally used to receive diplomats, now transformed into a grotesque public stage. The doors remained wide open. The guests, trapped by guards, were forced to stand within full view. Witnesses to a violation they prayed God would not record. What followed was not a marriage. It was the destruction of 2 human beings. Whispers turned to choked sobs. Some clergy closed their eyes and prayed. Others watched in numb silence, knowing that looking away too long might attract Cesare's attention. Lucrezia drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind separating to survive what her body could not escape. Alfonso moved mechanically, each act stripping away the last pieces of his dignity, his honor, his identity as a prince. Twice the ordeal was completed. Twice the onlookers suffered in horror. And when Alexander commanded the third, Cesare nodded in approval like a judge sealing a death sentence. By dawn, something sacred had died inside every person in that palace. The bride, the groom, the witnesses, even the Vatican walls seemed to sag beneath the weight of what they had contained. Rome would never be the same. By the time dawn crept through the high windows of the Borgia apartments, the Vatican no longer resembled the seat of Christianity. Wine jugs lay overturned, chestnuts were crushed into the marble floors, and prostitutes huddled in corners with empty eyes. Guards stood motionless, staring at the ground, as if afraid that looking up would force them to acknowledge what they had witnessed. Lucrezia lay in the adjoining room, perfectly still, her golden hair tangled across the pillows, her wedding gown rumpled and stained. She stared upward, expression emptied of life, as though her spirit had slipped somewhere unreachable during the endless hours of humiliation. Alfonso sat at the edge of the bed, trembling violently, his face buried in his hands. No battlefield, no political threat, nothing in his life had ever shattered him as completely as this night. Within days, he would leave Rome in silence, a silence he would carry for the rest of his life. He never spoke of that night again. Not once, but Rome spoke. Italy spoke. Europe screamed. Word of the chestnut banquet spread like a disease. At first whispers, then murmurs, then full reports carried by horrified ambassadors. Letters describing the show were encoded, smuggled, hidden, as though the truth itself were dangerous to carry. One Venetian envoy wrote, "What happened in the Vatican goes beyond even the darkest imaginations of ancient Rome." His message declared that Alexander VI had disgraced not only his daughter, but the church itself. Priests across Italy began preaching hidden condemnations. Noble courts trembled at the implications. If this was the conduct of the Pope, what did holiness even mean? And in Germany, a young monk named Martin Luther would later cite the Borgia banquet as evidence of Rome's moral collapse, a symbol of corruption so severe it helped ignite the flames of the Protestant Reformation. Inside the Vatican, panic took a different form. Documents were sealed. Witnesses were warned. Some records vanished entirely. But one man refused to let the night disappear. Johann Burchard, the master of ceremonies. His hands trembled as he wrote, knowing his account might be buried for centuries or destroyed outright. Yet he recorded every detail. The prostitutes, the chestnuts, the forced consummation, preserving what the church hoped the world would forget. The Borgias would fall. Alexander VI would die within months. Cesare would lose everything. But the night of October 30th, 1503 endured, not as scandal, but as a symbol of what happens when absolute power is left unchallenged. In the weeks that followed the infamous banquet, the Vatican moved with a strange, brittle normality, as though pretending nothing had happened could erase the memory carved into its walls. But those who lived through the night carried the weight of it everywhere they went. Lucrezia Borgia left Rome soon afterward, traveling to Ferrara with her new husband. She walked through the streets as a duchess wrapped in velvet and jewels, but her eyes betrayed a sorrow deeper than any title could mask. Those who knew her privately spoke of a quiet sadness, a gentleness broken by something she could never name aloud. She funded charities, protected artists, and cultivated beauty wherever she could, as if trying to build a world gentler than the one she had been forced to endure. But the wound of her wedding night never healed. It simply settled into the background of her life, a shadow that followed her through every hall of the Ferrara court. She bore Alfonso children, but their marriage, poisoned by Rome, never recovered. They lived beside each other as partners in duty, not in affection. Alfonso himself remained silent until the end of his days. He never spoke of the Vatican again, not to his family, not to his allies, not even to Lucrezia. A single night had hollowed out something inside him that words could never express. Meanwhile, fate turned against the Borgias. Alexander VI died only months after the banquet. Whispers spread that the same poison he once used on others had returned to claim him. Cesare, stripped of power and hunted by enemies, fled Italy and died violently in a lonely Spanish ambush. His body was mutilated and thrown into an unmarked grave. Yet their fall did not erase what happened. The night remained, a scar on the church, a turning point for Europe, and a wound carried by two souls who never asked to be part of the Borgia legacy. The night of October 30th, 1503, did not fade with the Borgias. It survived in whispered accounts, in Burchard's trembling diary, in the fury of reformers who pointed to Rome's corruption as proof that the sacred had been betrayed. Lucrezia and Alfonso lived on, but the Vatican's darkest wedding remained their unspoken burden, a reminder that evil thrives when silence becomes obedience. History remembers the chestnut banquet not as a scandal, but as a warning. When absolute power loses restraint, even the holiest places can descend into hell. If you've walked with us through this entire descent, you now understand why some pages of history were never meant to be forgotten. Stories like this survive only when people are willing to confront them, to drag what was hidden back into the light. If you believe the past must be remembered, if you think the darkest chapters should never be buried, then subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which moment unsettled you the most. Because the further we go, the deeper the shadows become, and you won't want to face what comes next alone.